Good afternoon. I'm Mike Romersky, Superintendent of the Hempfield School District, and we're very thankful that all of you have joined us today for this important webinar on COVID-19 vaccinations and variations. On behalf of all the superintendents across the county, I want to extend our greatest appreciation to Penn Medicine LGH, specifically Dr. Martin and his team, as well as our county commissioners who have all worked to support us as school districts as we've opened when we opened back in August. And most importantly, we've been working really hard with a collaborative partnership with Penn Medicine, again, that was supported by our commissioners to make sure that our schools can stay open and be safe. And Penn Medicine LGH has been instrumental in making that happen and working with us countless hours as we planned and continue to work through this pandemic. And we've provided a variety of these sessions, but as we're getting closer to more information and more vaccines being rolled out, we thought this was an important topic. So Dr. Martin has agreed to spend some time with us this afternoon. We are recording this session, and we will make sure we get the link out to all of the school districts. Throughout this entire presentation, if at any point you have a question or something sparks a question as we get further, you can certainly post your question in the question box on your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll go through the questions, take as many as we can. And if we can't answer all the questions, we will certainly make sure we get the answers out so districts can post them on their websites. So with that, we have very fortunate today to have Dr. Jeffrey Martin. He is the chair of the Department of Family and Community Medicine at Penn Medicine Lancaster General Health, but he's also the medical director of the Lancaster County Contact Tracing Program. So he's here today to talk about COVID-19 vaccinations and variations. So Dr. Martin, thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And I have to say the appreciation goes both ways. I have been so amazed and pleasantly surprised, actually, about the ability of the schools to do something that none of us thought we would be able to do just 1 year ago. But the schools have come together. The community has come together along with the help of the county commissioners to really help deal with COVID in multiple aspects in our community. So I have a great appreciation for what the schools have done and continue to do. And obviously the learning curve has been quite steep for all of us. So today, what I would like to do is, and it's kind of hard for me not to talk without giving some sort of brief status update about where we're at in terms of numbers and the metrics related to COVID-19. I'll talk a little bit about how the COVID-19 vaccine works and the myths that are out there about the vaccine, and hopefully try to dispel some of those myths. I know many people have heard about the new variant strains related to COVID-19, so we'll talk about those briefly. And finally, I'll end up with just talking about the current status of the distribution plan, which tends to be changing on a pretty regular basis. And I know something that's frustrating a lot of people in our community, and then we'll open it up for questions. So taking a look at what's gone on with COVID during the months from November on, which is really the start of the third surge. Remember back in October, our incidence rate was only about 40 to 50 per 100,000. We've been well above that for about a month or two now, in the 300 reaching the high 400 range. So we have to realize that the community spread that we have now is still 6, 7, 8 times higher than it was back when schools opened in September. And the way we look at these metrics again is that we typically see the R value, which is the yellow line, and the gray line, which is cases, start to rise first. And then about a week or so after that, you start to see an increase in the percent positivity of tests. And about a week after that, you start to see an increase in hospitalization. So about 2 weeks after you see a rise in cases, you start to see an uptick in hospitalizations. And on this line, that's the orange line. And then finally, about a week after that, so 3 to 4 weeks after you see an initial uptake in cases, you start to see an increase in deaths, and that's the red line. So we have peaked somewhat, but it's been somewhat of a jagged peak. We've had some up and downs, some peaks and valleys, but in general, we're trending downward. And the optimism is that hopefully we won't be seeing as much COVID as we saw through the months of December and January when we get into the latter part of February. The percentage of positive tests has gone down, which is good. That tells us that The pandemic spread is not quite as robust as it's been. We dropped from 12.1% down to 10.8%, but we're still high compared to a little bit higher than the rest of Pennsylvania, and definitely higher than our benchmarks. The World Health Organization suggests we should be down below 5%. The turnaround times right now for test has been gotten quite a bit better, and I think that is something that's going to help us do contact tracing quicker. People will be notified if they are positive quicker and also negative quicker. So most of the tests that we're doing on a community COVID basis, those people who are symptomatic were those people who are asymptomatic but were exposed to somebody. Those tests are taking less than 24 hours to come back now. So that is very helpful, not only in making public health quarantine and isolation decisions, but also giving people peace of mind that they don't have to sit around for several days isolating while awaiting their test results. Travel to non-essential businesses continues to be problematic in Lancaster. We're using this as a proxy metric to look at how well we do social distancing in the community. And frankly, we have not been as good as our surrounding neighbors. So we are only 6% below baseline, meaning that travel to non-essential businesses are basically about what they were pre-COVID. But if you look at the counties around us, they are having a much more decrease below the pre-COVID baseline. So Berks, Chester, Dauphin, Lebanon, and York all are having increasing social distancing as measured by decreased travel to non-essential businesses. And this is a metric that really has been quite accurate, I think, through this entire surge, and one that I've been looking at on a regular basis. And you can see the projection of the squiggly lines at the end of this graph, that even with the poor social distancing that we have, we will sort of start to see a decrease in the number of cases going forward. But that can all change, again, if the social distancing rates don't get any better. So uh, the final graph I'll show in terms of the current surge is based on the R value. The R value, again, is the number of people that one person with COVID can infect. We'd like to see this number below 1 because that means that the surge is waning. If it's above 1, we will see an increase in cases. And what we saw really was a Thanksgiving bump, which we expected, and that took a little while to come down, but we saw an increase in our social distancing rates, which really dropped this R value not only below 1, but pretty below 1 by the end of December. We did have a holiday and New Year's bump in early January, and again, it dropped pretty well through mid-January, towards the end of January. And just recently we had a big spike. Now, I think that may be an anomaly. I think that's probably related to a backlog of cases that got reported all on one day. I think we had 800 reported on one day. I don't think that means we had 800 cases on one day. So I think that's why the R value is off. But what this tells us is that social distancing does work. Our community can bring down cases, and we can staunch the spread of the pandemic within the community if we all behave, continue the mitigation measures, continue social distancing, and do the things that we know protect people from getting COVID. I'm hopeful that this orange line here, which is Lancaster County, will drop below 1 again, and we'll start to continue to see us on the other side of that third surge. So let's talk a little bit about vaccinations and variants. And I think before we go into actually what the vaccines do, I want to talk a little bit about how messenger RNA works. So you may need to pull back either junior high or high school biology. I couldn't quite remember when I learned this, but it's the exquisite mechanism of how the human body and all life actually carries on its functions in a very elegant way. And essentially you have double-stranded DNA, which is inside the nucleus. And that is the library or the encyclopedia that encodes for all the proteins that are necessary for regular homeostasis and life. Through a process called transcription, that DNA is broken apart through some enzymes, and it is encoded onto RNA. So this is an RNA template. So it's kind of like a carbon copy of or a mirror copy of the DNA. And that RNA travels outside the nucleus and into the cytoplasm of the cell. It goes to the ribosomes, and it carries the message that it encoded. So that's why we call it messenger RNA. It connects here under the third bullet with the ribosome, and it reads the messenger RNA and it pieces together proper amino acids to make a protein, whatever protein that the cell is making at the time. And this is a process called translation. And finally, these proteins are then stored, utilized by the cell, or if it's a glandular cell where it secretes it, or if it's an endocrine gland, it may secrete it as a hormone into your body. But these are basically the proteins that allow life to exist. So what we'll see basically with the mRNA vaccines is that they essentially skip step 1 and step 2, and they introduce the messenger RNA directly into cells that take it up and make the spike protein. So let's take a look a bit about what that would look like. So the two currently available vaccinations in the United States, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, both work using this novel messenger RNA mechanism. In these vaccines, the messenger RNA carries the instructions to make the spike protein on the coronavirus particle. So the spike protein are the little tiny projections that come off the top, the little red bumps when you see pictures of the coronavirus. And so messenger RNA, which is made through a chemical process in a laboratory, encodes that spike protein. It's then put into, the best way to describe it would be a fat bubble that protect the mRNA, and then it's injected into your arm as the vaccine. Macrophages, which are specialized white blood cells near the injection site, take up the mRNA, and that mRNA goes to the ribosome of that macrophage, and it starts to make spike protein for the coronavirus. The macrophage then puts those spike proteins on the surface, and then the immune system comes down, recognizes it as a foreign body, and starts the immune response to make antibodies and also what we call killer T cells to kill the spike protein. So that way, if you do encounter an actual spike protein from an actual coronavirus, your immune system has already seen it, it knows what it is, and it knows that it needs to attack it and get rid of it as soon as possible. So that's how these vaccinations work. They utilize the body's own very elegant immune response system to create a template for taking care of the coronavirus if people get infected. I have Dr. Wiseman's picture in here because he actually started working on messenger RNA vaccines over 15 years ago. So it gets to this point that this is a technology that has been around quite a while. There has been issues related to trying to keep the messenger RNA from being degraded too fast in the human body and not being able to produce the immune response. So we had some breakthroughs related to ways in which we could protect the messenger RNA, but this is not really a new type of technology. This is just building on technology that has been well studied in the past. So another way to visualize this is you can see the vaccine going into someone's skin. The messenger RNA is in the lipid shell, it gets taken up by the cell and encoded by the ribosome. It in no way gets into the nucleus of the cell. The spike proteins are then made and put on the surface of the cell, and that's how the immune system recognizes it. So it's important to note that, again, this is just triggering the immune response in an identical way that our immune system is triggered when we encounter foreign RNA or DNA from viruses all the time. It's also something, the way we fight bacterial illnesses, it's also the way we respond to toxins and even sometimes cancer cells that occur in our own body. Our immune system can often take care of cancer cells much better than we can with external drugs. And there's a lot of immunotherapies now related to taking care of certain types of cancer. And it's also important to note that this synthetic messenger RNA, which is inherently unstable, which is the reason why we have to put it in a lipid shell, and at least with the Pfizer vaccine, have to keep it very cool, below 80 to 90 degrees Celsius, is degraded quite rapidly. It doesn't hang around very long. So it's really in the body only for some hours and doesn't hang around very long at all. And that's really why it's been difficult to make the messenger RNA vaccine, because we didn't have the right combination of temperature and lipid envelope to keep them stable to be able to transport them to vaccine sites. So you can imagine that when the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine came out and then was confirmed with the Moderna vaccine, that those of us in medicine, those of us in public health, were actually over the moon at the efficacy of this vaccine. So it proved to be 95% effective at preventing symptomatic COVID illness and serious illness after 2 shots. I believe 14 days after 2 shots was the endpoint of what it was looking at. Some of the vaccines look at different endpoints, but the vaccine for the Pfizer and the Moderna, the endpoints were pretty similar in that it was looking at prevention of serious illness. So you can see that it was tested in multiple age groups. It was tested obviously in both gender groups, multiple racial and ethnic groups. The African American cohort in here ended up having 100% vaccine efficacy, which is quite amazing. And it was tested in multiple countries just to get around this issue that there may be other variants of the virus in different countries, and would it still be effective? And it was still found to be quite effective in Argentina, Brazil, and obviously as well as the United States. So the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine have very similar ingredients. The main difference between the two is that makeup of that lipid envelope that goes around. And they toyed with doing different kinds of things. Moderna was able to get it to the point where they didn't have to do the cold storage quite as much as Pfizer, which has made the Moderna vaccine a little bit easier because you don't need super cold refrigerators or freezers that only really hospitals and labs have. It can be put into a regular a freezer. And other than that, there's a lot of similarity. Both have some natural sugars in them and some buffering agents. Neither of these has any mercury or thimerosal. There are no, quote, preservatives in any of these. Neither was made using fetal tissue culture. So there's no fetal tissue in these vaccines. The messenger RNA is essentially put together in a lab using a chemical process. So it can create very accurate and very pure strands of just messenger RNA. By the way, it's something that we've been able to do for more than 10 years. So that part of it's not hard. It also means that when we have new variants coming down the pike and the spike protein on top of the coronavirus changes, we may be able to quickly identify the mutation and change the messenger RNA very quickly, put it back into the vaccine using the same envelope, and we may end up having multiple mRNAs to different mutations. So it's also a very quick way to change slightly the makeup of the vaccine. So that will be interesting to see if that happens. There are side effects associated with these vaccines, as there are with many vaccines. These vaccines do induce an inflammatory response, and that is where the side effects come from. Soreness at the site is the most common, but frankly, there are also systemic reactions that can happen. So fatigue, muscle aches or myalgias, headache, chills, they're all very common. And it's important to know that having these side effects are actually reflective of the fact that your immune system is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So your immune system is causing these side effects as it reads that spike protein and starts to develop immunity to potential coronavirus infection down the road. We have not seen significant reactions. In fact, up to June 6th, anaphylaxis or severe allergic reactions was quite rare, occurring in about 1 per 100,000. So we haven't seen any of those severe reactions here at LGH. We have occasionally had people pass out because they didn't like getting the vaccine and their nervous system got a little bit hyperactive. That's not really an allergic reaction. We've had a few lower level allergic reactions that were taken care of by Benadryl, but nothing that we had to use an EpiPen for or to admit somebody to the hospital because they were anaphylactic. Interestingly, in people over the age of 65, they're less severe, and that's probably because the immune system is not quite as active and robust. And the symptoms can be a little bit worse after the second dose. There are several other vaccines out there. The Janssen & Janssen vaccine is working towards being being accepted by the FDA. I believe in this country, I don't know if we've actually seen it being given the FDA go-ahead as of yet. It uses a adenovirus, which is a type of virus that can cause common cold symptoms generally, but it's a replication deficient adenovirus, meaning that it can't replicate. So it doesn't give you adenovirus or the disease, but what it does give you is a little piece of DNA encoding that spike protein. So it's used as a Trojan horse, so to speak, that gets into the immune system, and that little piece of DNA it gets transmitted into mRNA, and then that gets transmitted into spike protein. The benefits of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that it is refrigeration stable for 3 months. It's a single one dose regimen. And there were some unexplained illness that were since taken care of in the phase 1 and 2 trials, and I believe the phase 3 trial is getting close to ending. The AstraZeneca or Oxford vaccine is similar. It is a adenovirus, but it is given 2 IM doses 28 days apart, again, refrigeration stable. So in places where they don't have significant freezer capability, or certainly the super cold freezers, these kinds of vaccines are probably going to be much better in those resource poor settings. So let's talk a little bit about some of the vaccine myths. So the CDC is very interested in letting everybody know that it's important to get vaccinated because it can help to prevent you from getting sick with COVID-19. It'll help reduce admissions to the hospital, but what we don't know is if it actually prevents transmission. So it's still important to wear a mask, to follow all the mitigation measures, because we're not sure if the vaccine actually prevents enough virus from infecting somebody to the point where they don't have symptoms, but where they could pass it on to somebody else. People who have already had COVID-19 would still benefit from getting vaccinated. But we don't know how long that natural immunity lasts. There's some evidence that about 50% of the populations in 50% of the population, they lose their antibodies after 3 months. Now, they may still have T-cell immunity, which is another type of immunity, but we don't know because we just haven't had enough time with the virus and with the vaccination to know how long the immunity lasts. So people that have had COVID should still get vaccinated, generally after they are out of their isolation period and no longer symptomatic. The COVID vaccines cannot give you COVID-19. There's no COVID-19 in them. They are just utilizing specific genetic material to encode that spike protein. And also, COVID-19 vaccines will not cause you to test positive on any of the tests because that checks for virus, and there's no virus in the vaccine. It's pretty clear that we're able to tell when somebody gets vaccinated what's a vaccine-related side effect and what may be COVID that was brewing in your system before you went to go get the vaccine. So for instance, if you get the vaccine and you start to cough, or you have loss of taste or smell, then that's probably, that's not related to the vaccine. And so you should be worked up for COVID. But if you have a low-grade fever, some myalgias, that's generally self-limited, it goes away in 24 to 48 hours, and it's right around the time you got the vaccine. We can generally, as long as you weren't exposed to anybody with COVID, we can pretty much assuredly say that's related to the vaccine and not COVID-19. The safety of these vaccines, I know, has been very concerning for a lot of people. I think it's important to know that there were no safety steps that were skipped for these vaccines. They did come out quite a bit quicker because that was related to the fact that we had already done a lot of research in the preceding decades around these types of vaccines. There were a few really important breakthroughs related to that lipid envelope, and the federal government bought doses of vaccine before they even got through the third stage trial. So it took a lot of the risk away from the pharmaceutical companies. The ACIP, which is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which I listen to very closely as a family doctor, and it's an independent group, so independent of the FDA and independent of the CDC, actually are the ones that approve this. So there is not only government oversight, but there's independent regulatory oversight. And in part, the reason why these vaccines came out again so quickly is that we had a lot of COVID in our community. So we were able to you can imagine with a lower level infection that's circulating in the community, if you give somebody a vaccine and some people sterile water as a placebo, you might have to wait a year or two to see if there's a difference in the two groups. But with so much COVID circulating in our community, these trials finished rather quickly. And so it was unprecedented in its speed, but I don't believe that it is unprecedented by cutting any safety corners. And again, it's going to be very important that we continue to put out the message that vaccination is only one measure to help stop the pandemic. You still have to continue to do all the other pieces: cover your nose and mouth, social distance, avoid crowds, try to limit travel to non-essential businesses, wash your hands frequently, and so forth. And we probably won't see much change in case numbers related in our community to COVID for probably about 3 to 4 months. So the vaccination is not going to immediately make us safe and get us around the corner, but we will get there eventually. There are some nice CDC COVID-19 vaccine websites that I would encourage you to visit. There's a chock full of information. So let's talk a little bit about some of the COVID-19 vaccine myths. The first one is that the vaccines can change your DNA. I told you that that's not possible. The messenger RNA does not go anywhere near the nucleus, and the human body does not have an enzyme to transcribe the messenger RNA into DNA. So there is no way that these can change your DNA. There's no microchip in it, at least there wasn't in the shot that I got. It seems like it would be really difficult to get it through that little tiny needle. And because you're pulling up 10 doses from one vial, how do you even see the little microchip to make sure that you're getting one? You know, I, in some ways, even addressing it kind of, I don't know. I don't think there's a microchip in it. The vaccine was not rushed. It has been very safe. If you've had COVID, you still need the vaccine because we don't know how long immunity lasts. You still have to wear your mask after you get the vaccines. The vaccines are don't have a lot of stuff in them, and I gave you the ingredients. So there's no preservatives, there's no mercury, there's no other harmful things. Remember that messenger RNA degrades quite rapidly over a number of hours. More people will die from a negative side effect than from the vaccine. That has not been proven true. The major side effects, and I don't know if we've actually cataloged any deaths related to vaccine administration, but anaphylaxis, which would be the most major side effect, only occurs in 1 per 100,000. We've already had over 450,000 deaths related to COVID just in our country. You can't get COVID from the vaccine. Can COVID cause infertility in both men and women? Pregnant women were excluded from the study. Breastfeeding women were excluded from the study. There were a few women that got pregnant after getting the vaccine. They did not have any untoward effects. The vaccine will create antibodies that will go across the placenta into a growing fetus, and also antibodies that will get into the breast milk. But it's probably not possible that messenger RNA could get into breast milk because the lipid factor of breast milk would degrade it quite rapidly. And even if it did, the baby's digestive system, who was breastfeeding, would kill the messenger RNA before it entered any cells. So the infertility piece, although we haven't actually studied it, I'm finding it hard to find a physiologic mechanism by which this vaccination could even get to the placenta, could even cause infertility. So if there was even a plausible way that could happen, I would definitely entertain it. And again, yes, COVID vaccine can affect the growing fetus, but it can affect the growing fetus by introducing the antibodies that the mother produces into the fetus so that they're protected from COVID at birth. So that's why we give other immunizations like influenza and pertussis to pregnant moms, because we want the baby to have as much immunity as possible right when they're born. There are a lot of variants out there. The most common strain right now is this D614G. It started in Europe and now it's the most common strain. The UK variant has been identified since September in our country. It seems to be spreading more and more throughout the US. The good news is that it may be more transmissible and there may be some increase in severity of illness, but it doesn't appear to be resistant to current vaccines. So that's the key. The South African variant, we've only identified that in a few places in the US, seems to be more resistant to vaccine and also to the monoclonal antibodies. But thank goodness we haven't seen a lot of that in the community. The Brazilian variant is also unique in the fact that there's some resistance to the monoclonal antibody treatments. We're not sure yet about vaccines. There was some indication that people were getting reinfected with this Brazilian variant. So, we don't think reinfection is a very common phenomenon, but they're keeping an eye on it. And then there's some variants in California and Ohio. The CDC has a nice map. There has been 541 cases of the UK variant in the US as of February 2nd, and just 10 in PA. And you can see that the South African strain, there's only been 3 reported cases, and the Brazil strain, there's only been 2 reported cases. So no reason to panic just yet. And there is a surveillance system in place so that we can do genomic analysis of various COVID infections so that we can discover any of these strains circulating in the community. It's good news that the Pfizer COVID vaccine and most likely the Moderna vaccine are efficacious against the UK strain. So there was no evidence of decreased vaccine efficiency. So briefly about vaccine distribution. So initially, this was the priority scheme that we were looking at. 1A was healthcare personnel and long-term care residents, and 1B were the folks in schools, so teachers, support staff, daycare, et cetera. And so we kind of geared up for this. We were expecting that this would sort of be how we would roll this out in our community. And then about a little less than 2 weeks ago, Pennsylvania, the state threw us a bit of a curveball, and they added a large number of folks to this phase 1A group. So people that are healthcare personnel and long-term care facilities like the prior, but also anybody over the age of 65 and persons age 16 to 64 with chronic conditions. And you can read what those chronic conditions are. Essentially what this did was to increase the number of people in 1A by about tenfold. So unfortunately, because supply has been limited and just coming out in spurts and starts, that we have a much larger pool of folks in 1A. It pushed back those in school, teachers and staff who are in the 1B group pretty significantly. We're still debating a little bit with DOH to say, is this really something that we need to follow? But for now, this is what the state is telling us that we should be doing. We do have good information, and the state has been quite transparent about the number of vaccines that have been given to different counties. Lancaster, I'm proud to say, is the 5th most fully vaccinated county in the state. Philadelphia is not on here, so I guess they would probably be the 6th. We are the 6th largest county in the state, so that seems to be appropriate, despite what you heard about a per capita amount of vaccine being distributed in Lancaster County in the paper today. So DOH, if you look at the right, has taken a sort of peppering approach to get vaccine out to many different locations. So the calculus there is maybe a lot of different locations and just small amounts to each of those locations may be a great way to get vaccine out in the community. I'm not sure that's how it's playing out in Lancaster. If anything, I think that taking this approach actually seems to create distrust, because your neighbor can call Wise Pharmacy and find out that they have a vaccine available, and they'll sign up, and then the neighbor, when they call an hour later, finds out they don't have vaccine. So in my mind, I'm not sure if this is the best way to go. And so what the health system has done in partnering with the other health systems in the county and along with the county itself is to think about standing up a mass vaccination site. And you may have heard about this in the paper. So the mass vaccination site is going to be at a place that has a lot of square footage and also a large parking area, so that we can do maybe 2,500 and maybe even up to 5,000 vaccinations a day. It's well in the planning phase. We have the organizational structure and the data and software IT support that we need in order to do this. The folks that are going to outfit this area that has been taken care of at this point, it looks like if everything goes okay, we may be able to stand this up by late February, which is pretty quick, or into early March or mid-March. Having a mass vaccination place, to me, allows us to bring especially vulnerable populations to the vaccination site. Folks that are able and savvy enough to work phones, to find out where they might get vaccine at one of these smaller pharmacies in the community, they're in a lower risk category than people that may be elderly and alone, that don't have someone that can help them with trying to figure out where to go to for vaccination. So the peppering approach is okay, but I think we need both. I think we need a mass vaccination area that's easily accessible by public transportation that we can bring people to, especially those who are vulnerable and may not have the wherewithal to get there. I think that's going to be important to do it alongside of all these other ways that DOH is rolling out the vaccine. And so we've been in discussions with them about how best to do that. So what can schools be doing now? I think inform your staff about the PA Department of Health and County updates on the vaccine phases and distribution. Manage expectations because this is going to take a while. Calling and emailing may get you the vaccine, but it's more likely not to, and it's more likely just to end in some frustration. I haven't been doing that personally for my mother. She wants to know when I'm going to get when she can get the vaccine. I feel like she will probably get it through her doctor's office because our primary care offices will get limited doses of the vaccine and start to roll it out via a priority mechanism, and they'll be reaching out to people for that. I think we need to understand it's going to take a long time, unfortunately, for Lancaster County and the rest of the U.S. to get vaccinated. We need 65 to 70% for that magical herd immunity. But we're not going to be able to vaccinate ourselves out of the pandemic in the short term. So in the short term, we still need to keep doing all the important things that we need to do. Schools have done a great job. If only our other congregate settings, could model what the schools have done, we'd be in so much better shape. If our community acted like how the schools are acting, we'd be in much better shape. And I think schools can play a key role in not only being a role model for how to confront this, but also in limiting the disinformation about the vaccine and be the voice of reason and science, like you've been in the past and will continue to be in the future. So thank you very much for having me, and I'll pass it back over to Mike for any questions.
Great, thanks, Dr. Martin. And again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to post your question. We'll see them come through and I'll be able to share them or ask them to Dr. Martin. All right, so can you comment on how Tylenol ibuprofen affects the efficacy if you take it prior to a vaccine?
So with ibuprofen, there may be a theoretical effect because the the way the vaccine works is it induces an inflammatory response. And then when that's happening, your body responds to it with the cells that are important in helping to make both the antibody or the humoral immunity and also the cellular immunity. So there would be a theoretical effect that Advil could potentially be problematic. Tylenol shouldn't be problematic at all. That's something that we recommend. I have to say, when I got my second shot, I took some Advil about 12 hours into it because I was working in the hospital all day and I was having a hard time going up and down the steps. So a little Advil seemed to help and got me through the rest of the day. So in that scenario, I don't think it's problematic.
Okay. There's a question here. Can you repeat if there is an expected date for rollout for teachers?
Yes, there's no expected date. It's all dependent on supply. It's all dependent also if the Department of Health kind of buys into this plan of a mass vaccination site. Now, one of the things that I think we could offer them is that the Pfizer vaccine is being taken up at a little lower rate because it's difficult to handle. It has the cold storage problem, and I think we can handle it because we do have the super cold freezers here in the hospital that could maintain the supply, and then we could get it out to the mass vaccination site and get it into people's arms fairly quickly. So it's, yeah, I can't really tell you a date. I wish I could. That would solve a lot of consternation that people have, but it will happen. People will get vaccinated. It's probably just going to be a little later than what most of us thought.
And I can add in from the school perspective, we have no additional information other than what Dr. Martin has shared. We pass on the information when we get it, but this is a personal decision. This is not a decision in which schools are mandating for individuals, and we are not part of kind of the actual planning process. So as we get the information, we will pass it on to our staff.
I would say if you're offered a vaccine, and again, our offices are going to do this. I don't know about the other health system primary care offices, but we're going to start looking through our list of patients that are 75 and older, and as we get supply, be able to reach out them through the patient portal. So if you are part of LGH, sign up for My LG Health and make sure that you have that. So if you do get an invitation, you'll be aware of it. And I would say the same thing about the other health systems. Use their patient portal, because I think a lot of them are using that as well. If you find out that there's a place that gets it and you meet the priority group, get it. You know, there's no reason at this point to wait and sit back. And if you find a place where you or someone is offering it to you, go ahead and get it.
This is a follow-up to the ibuprofen question. It says, how far in advance can you take it without it theoretically affecting the efficacy? Night before, a couple hours?
Yeah, so it's a theoretical thing. So that's a hard one to say. Again, I would probably not take it until you need it. That's probably what I would say. The side effects have not been overwhelming, so we haven't seen a lot of people call off from work. But you know, it's probably good that you don't have, say, all the first grade teachers get it on the same day. You know, so or like here in the hospital, all the ED staff get it on the same day, because you know there may be people that are out a day or two. But again, most cases we're not seeing people have to take off of work.
There's a question here. According to the CDC, most age groups, the survival rate of COVID-19 is 99.97%. So why is any vaccine even necessary? And then the second question is, you said no steps were skipped during the study of trials. Animal trials were skipped. Previous animal trials in earlier years never passed because the animals were exposed to the natural virus and became ill, and many died. Can you explain that?
Yeah, there were a lot of animal trials initially. My understanding was that the vaccine didn't pass those trials because it was degraded too rapidly, so it didn't create an immune response that they thought. I haven't done a deep dive to look at exactly all the animal trials that were done, but you're right. I mean, these vaccines have been around for a long time, and initially they weren't very successful. Which I think is kind of amazing that it sort of came together, and it's certainly at this level of efficacy. What was the other question? Oh, so you're right. There's not a lot of serious illness under the age of 18. There has been some identified problems and even deaths in that age group. Fortunately, I don't think we've had anybody under the age of 18 die in Pennsylvania that I'm aware of. But the reason we recommend it for folks is that eventually the hope is that even though younger people are not susceptible to severe disease, they can transmit it. And you know, that's how death has occurred in many nursing homes in our county. So it was brought in by unwittingly by staff members who were asymptomatic with infection, and basically they set a match to the to the tinder, whatever metaphor you want to use, and that's why we've had you know the mortality and morbidity well over 800 deaths just in our county alone. So infectious disease like this doesn't care about your age, your creed, your political affiliation, your religion, your ethnicity. You know, the virus doesn't stop to check those things before it infects somebody. And so we all have to sort of reach a certain level of immunity for all of us to feel safe. So I guess that's how I would respond to that question.
The question here, are local hospitals coordinating with the mass vaccination site?
Yeah, so it was important, I think, from the county perspective for all the health systems to be involved. Lancaster General, obviously, with our market share and having about 70% of sort of the population that go to our locations in the county is the largest of those. But we definitely have reached out to um, Penn State Hershey. We've reached out to UPMC and also to WellSpan Ephrata. And there is interest that those folks would want to be involved in this mass vaccination site as well. So that's how we did contact tracing. We got Lancaster Health Center involved. We got WellSpan Ephrata involved, and it's generally for a public health um, program like that. It's much better to have that than to kind of go it alone. So that's where we've been since the beginning of this pandemic.
And if you've had COVID already, how long should you wait to get the vaccine?
So it's not likely for you to be reinfected within 3 months of having the vaccine, so you can wait. You probably should wait at least until you're symptom free, um, just so that you don't think that the symptoms that you have are kind of reactivated COVID versus symptoms from the vaccine. And but you know, originally people were saying, well, I'll wait my 90 days because I don't want to take vaccine ahead of somebody else. At this point, I would just say, yes, you can probably wait the 90 days. But again, if you get an invite to get the vaccine and you're over COVID and you're no longer having symptoms related to COVID, it's okay to get the vaccine. We're also recommending that you don't get any vaccines 2 weeks prior to getting the COVID vaccine or 2 weeks after. And that's not because of interactions or side effects related to the vaccine. That's because we don't want the symptoms that you get. For instance, the shingles vaccine can also give similar symptoms, or the Pneumovax or the tetanus shot, and those kinds of things can give similar symptoms. We don't want them to interfere with any thoughts about what these side effects are, or whether they're related to that prior vaccine or to the COVID vaccine. So 2 weeks prior and 2 weeks after, you probably shouldn't get any other vaccinations.
Can the vaccine cause a COVID positive test?
No, no. So if you get the vaccine and you have a COVID positive test, it did not come from the vaccine. The vaccine does not have COVID in it. It only has that little tiny tuft of spike protein, and that the way that we test for COVID is to actually test for viral RNA, and there is no viral RNA to the point that the test will look for it. It's that spike protein. It gets degraded, and then you make antibodies. So there's no COVID in the vaccine itself that would potentially produce a positive test.
Mhm. And then I see three more here that commence. We'll do those, and then just watching the time. We respect everyone's time and your time, Dr. Martin. So we'll do these three, and then anything else that comes in, we'll make sure we get sent out. Just clarification: the 95% efficacy is not preventing transmission or spread, correct? It's the 95% efficacy in preventing severe symptoms.
That's correct. Now they could have looked at transmission, but it would have been a much longer study to look at that because it just takes more time. And now there are studies that are looking at that. So we should have some information on that, hopefully in the next couple months, next few months.
And do we know what the long-term side effects can be expected from injections of polyethylene glycol, if I said that correctly?
Polyethylene glycol. I don't know what the long-term effects are for injection of polyethylene glycol. Polyethylene glycol, I think, is something that we use for like isn't that what you're referencing in Miralax? But I would have to take a look at that. And
This person's saying it's in both vaccines.
yeah, so polyethylene glycol is typically not absorbed. That's how it is, at least with Miralax. But that would certainly be something that I would have to look at and get back to you about.
Okay. And then the last question here, will this vaccine become a yearly thing like a flu shot? And then do you have any words of hope as a healthcare worker? And when will things start to get better?
Well, we don't know. It's possible that it's possible that this would have to be a yearly thing. I mean, we've barely even had a year of it, right? So it's hard to know what's going to happen. It doesn't appear to be like flu, where it mutates that fast and in such a different way that you get antigenic drift and you need to get a totally new vaccine. But there are mutations that are coming up related to the spike protein, which is the main way that the coronavirus gets into cells. Um, like I said, I think that the beauty of this mRNA technology is that you can create a whatever template for whatever protein changes in that spike protein in the lab relatively quickly, and use the same lipid layer to get it out into people's arms. So we'll probably see some variation over time. If we discover that there's a variant that's circulating at greater than 50% in the population that's more deadly and not covered by the current vaccines, and if they need to tweak a little bit the messenger RNA to fight it, then then I could see you might need another shot. If the if we get to herd immunity and we're not having as much circulating virus around in general, we may not. The best way to prevent mutation is to prevent infection, because infection is how these viruses tend to mutate to get around the body's defense mechanism. So if we can prevent a large portion of the world's population from being infected, we're going to drastically slow down these mutations. And so that's kind of how I look at it. I was just taking a look at, yes, there is a type of polyethylene glycol, but it is not just straight polyethylene glycol. It's something else. These are the lipid layer that surrounds the messenger RNA. My understanding is that lipid layer, just like if you had any lipids in your system underneath your skin, gets degraded as well pretty quickly.
So again, I do want to thank everyone for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate you joining us. Dr. Martin, thank you very much for extending your time for 2 sessions today. We will get the recording link out to all the school districts so they can share it with their school communities. If other individuals have questions about the vaccines, you can go to vaccinatelancaster.org. That is a new website that is up. You can also do a search for the PA Department of Health and look under COVID. They actually do have COVID-19 vaccines. You can see what is in phase 1A, the current phase 1B, which would include the educators, grocery store workers, U.S. Postal Service workers, manufacturing workers, clergy, public transit, first responders, et cetera, and all the way down through phase 1C and phase 2. So there's links between the Department of Health site and the Vaccinate Lancaster site that you certainly can go to. Can always reach out if you have other questions. Please feel free to reach out to us. So again, I do thank you for your time. Have a great rest of your day. Take care and stay safe.